Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. To those of you who are there, who are already here, we're going to give it just a few more minutes to let other folks join. So just hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Hi, everyone. Thanks to those of you who have already joined. We're just going to give it another few minutes to let folks trickle in and we'll get started shortly. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this training event today. It's 1 p.m. now, but we'll give just a couple more minutes in case there are any stragglers, and then we'll get started in a little bit. So thank you again for being here with us. Hi, all. Just going to give it one more minute just to make sure that everyone who would like to join is able to, and we'll get going in just a minute. So thank you again for being here today. Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to today's training event on POS and PSA requisitions and core. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're at 1:03 now, so I think let's jump right in to make sure we have enough time for everything. And so thank you again for taking the time to be here today. My name is Julia Fussfeld. I'm the Procurement Policy Development Coordinator at OPM. I know you've all seen my face in some other trainings, so great to have you all here again. Today's training, we're going to review the POS and PSA requisition submission and approval process. And joining me today, I have Kathleen Benola from Core CT and Joan Soulsby from the OPM Budget Office. Also helping out today are Colin Earhart and Lars Benson. They are fellows from the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab. They're integral members of our team, so we're really grateful for their assistance, which you'll see behind the scenes. And in terms of what we're going to cover today, first, Kathleen is going to show us the functionality of the e-procurement module on Core, so how you actually submit a requisition. Then Joan from OPM Budget will share the process that she and her colleagues use to review POS and PSA requisitions from the budget perspective. And then I will be sharing more about the OPM finance review and approval process. So as you all know, there's two layers of OPM approval. The first is from the budget office and the second is from the finance office. And so Joan will go over the budget office process and I'll go over the finance office process. And the goal in this training is really to help all of you folks in our sister agencies understand how to sort of provide us with all the information that we need in a requisition to ensure that your requisitions are processed quickly and efficiently and that there aren't any holdups. Just a couple of quick logistical notes about the training. You will see there is a question and answer function that you can use on the side of the screen. You can feel free to submit questions throughout the training. We do have a dedicated time at the end where we'll address as many questions as we can. But any questions that we can't get to for timing reasons, we will go ahead and address in a document that we'll then email out after this training. So really don't be shy. Go ahead and ask away. And if your questions aren't addressed today, they will be at a later date. And Lars and Colin will be monitoring the question and answer throughout. So if you do have any sort of logistical questions or technical challenges, they can help to the best of their ability. And the last thing I just want to note is that this training is going to be focused specifically on requisitions for purchase of service and personal service agreement contracts, so POS and PSAs, not other types of core transactions. So just try to keep that in mind as we're going through the training and as any questions arise, that's what we'll best be able to address today. So with that, let's move on to the next slide and go ahead and jump right in. So first, I just want to walk us through the agenda for today. So the first thing we'll cover is a little bit about why we have a requisition system in place, what its function is, what it helps us achieve as state employees, and why it's important. Since I know many of you do a lot of these on a given day or week, I want to make sure we understand why we're putting you through this to begin with. Then from there, Kathleen from Core will go over the e-procurement module on Core and the sort of technical functions of how it works and how to submit a POS or PSA requisition. And she'll also share some resources that you can use when you're, using Core if any questions arise. Then from there, Joan from the budget office will share a little bit about her office's review process for requisitions and some tips to help ensure a quick review and approval from budget. Then I will go over the review process that myself and Kimberly Kennison, the Executive Financial Officer, use to review and approve requisitions from the finance office perspective. You'll hear from me and Joan about what might cause us to hold a requisition, which obviously results in a delay. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some good chunk of time for questions and answers. So hopefully we can get to any questions that you folks have today. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I wanted to first cover what is a requisition, why is it important, why do we have this process in place? So most simply put, a requisition is a formal entry in Core CT to initiate a transaction associated with a POS or a PSA. And as you folks are probably aware, Core CT is the financial system of record. It's where we keep all the information about contractors and vendors and making payments to them. So that's why we do this process in Core. And requisitions are really important because they sort of help us see the procurement process, help us see the steps that an agency might have gone through. And we use requisitions to request approval to post an RFP, to initiate a new contract, to get a sole source waiver, or to amend an existing contract. Those are just some examples of the types of transactions that you might be undertaking. And this requisition process allows us to document that proper approval processes have been followed. And that is a demonstration on our part as state employees that we're in compliance with agency regulations and statutory regulations. And the requisition system also allows us, like I mentioned, to ensure that the information associated with a contract is up to date in Core CT. And since Core is the financial system of record, it's really important that that is all accurate and up to date. Next slide, please. So now we understand sort of technically what is a requisition. So let's talk a little bit about why we have this review process at all. And so, as I mentioned, OPM provides two levels of review. The first comes from the budget office, and I'll sometimes refer to that in this training as OPM budget. And OPM budget is the office that manages, analyzes, and plans the state budget. So the budget office reviews requisitions to ensure that all requests are supported by the state budget or other available funds, meaning they make sure that there is actually funding to cover the requisition that's sort of being processed. And then they also are reviewing it to ensure consistency with executive and legislative policy. So the state budget is sort of a financial expression of the states and the executive branch and the legislative branch's policy priorities. And so any deviation from that budget is in some respects a deviation from policy. So the budget office sort of plays that role in tying all those financial and policy pieces together. My office, OPM Finance, is the second layer of review on OPM requisitions. And our office is really responsible for strengthening the financial management and procurement functions of the state. So because of that, we're using this review process to ensure that agencies are following proper procurement procedures, first and foremost. And I've talked in previous trainings about why proper procurement procedures are important, but just as a brief refresher, it's because procurement processes help us ensure that we're getting the best quality services for the best value. So this is our opportunity to make sure that those procurement procedures are being followed. And also, our office, OPM Finance, reports annually on all POS and PSA contracting activity. So payments made on existing POS and PSA contracts and any new POS or PSA contracts that come to be, those are all presented every year in a report that comes from my office. So this is it's really important for us to know what we're putting forth in that report and to know that it's defensible and reasonable. And so including us at this part of the process and the requisition process allows us to sort of stay on top of what information is going to be in that report and make sure that it's reasonable and defendable. So that's a little bit about why we have these OPM review processes. Next slide, please. So hopefully that helps orient you a little bit around why we have this process, why we're taking an hour and a half of your time to train you on it today. And so from here, now that we have that background, I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen Bonola from Core CT, and she's going to walk us through a little bit about how the e-procurement module works in Core. So Kathleen, over to you. Kathleen, I think you might be on mute there.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to go over a brief review of how to submit a requisition. It's basically 3 steps. The first slide here is step 1, where you define your requisition. One of the most important things is your requisition name so that you can find your requisition later on, or the budget and finance folks can locate your requisition easier when they go to manage rec if they're looking for it. One of the things that has been requested from OPM is that in the requisition name, you put the vendor name somewhere so that they can easily identify it. If you leave that field blank, it's going to default to your rec ID, which is really hard to identify. So naming it is really a good thing to do for both the requesters and OPM. Your priority, Julia will speak to that later in the presentation, but she does look at that and takes what you set your priority at of importance. The requisition type in here, you're either going to pick the PSA or the POS. You're going to go to the PSA details, and there will be 4 different rec types within that page. You'll answer your questions in there, and it's very intuitive. If you answer something wrong or if you leave something blank, a message is going to pop up and tell you exactly what it was that you're missing or that you did incorrectly. The next thing you're going to do are the line details. Shipping is defaulted, and chart fields can be defaulted. It depends how your agency sets you up when you first become a requester. Next slide. Step 2 is adding your EPro services. It's a lot like purchasing online. You're going to add your service description, and the clearer the description, the faster that OPM can identify and recognize and know what you're looking for, the value of your service, your supplier, and your start and end dates. And you click add to cart. And like when you're purchasing online, it opens up a shopping cart, and that line will be in the shopping cart. You can add additional lines if you need to by using the same process. And when you're finished, you would click on the checkout. Next slide. And step 3 is saving and submitting. So you see it's fairly simple, it's very intuitive. It's 1, 2, 3, save and submit. Your shopping cart is at your checkout. This is your last time that you can review it. We have a save for later. So if you're in a hurry or if you don't have all the information that you want, you can save it for later. So OPM would prefer that if you don't have all the information or you don't have the details, to please save it for later and then go back to it through Manage Rec and add the details so that they don't have to put it on hold, they don't have to question it, and you can get your approval done in a quick, responsive way. If you have everything in your requisition that you need and you're clear that you don't need to add anything else, then you can save and submit, and save and submit starts the process of the approval workflow. So save for later leaves it in an open status, or you can go back through Manage Rec and you can add to it. It does not go into approval workflow, and save for later, save and submit starts the approval workflow. Next slide. On this slide, we have a link to the EProcurement Job Aids, and as you can see, there are several that are specifically related to PSA and POS requisitions, the amendment, and converting the rec to contract. So depending upon what your roles are in core, you can either go here to get information, or you can also have your training liaison log a help desk ticket to core help desk and request some more in-depth training. Next slide. In the event that you have an issue, we ask that you log a help desk ticket through Footprints, and there's a link here on this page that will link you to the instructions on how to do it. If it is a technical system issue, you're going to report this to Core CT. So if you have data and you have a problem saving it in the system, or it doesn't display the way that you need it to, or any other technical issue with the data, you would log a Footprints ticket. If it's a business requirement, you have the data and you don't know what to do with it, or you don't know where it should be put, or you don't know if it's enough, then you would go to OPM for assistance there. And Julia will add later in the slideshow who to call or who to go to for help at OPM for business requirements. And that's basically it for Core CT. I'm going to hand it off now to Joan Soulsby for the OPM budget review process.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak briefly about the role of the OPM Budget and Financial Management Division in the review and approval of requisitions. The review process starts when the submission arrives on the work list of the agency's assigned budget analyst. And next slide, please. And our responsibilities and functions are shown on this slide. At the outset, we start by determining what sort of a requisition has been sent our way, be it a contract amendment or a new contract or request for approval to issue a request for proposal, for example. Next, we would look towards the information identifying the vendor or supplier, the funding source, the fund and class, or often referred to as the SID, associated with a particular request, and then the term of the contract, the start dates and end dates. We verify that amounts are consistent across the requisition, meaning that in certain cases, agencies will not only provide the financial information in the line comment boxes, but also provide dollar information within the written text. There are times when those numbers don't match up, and so we check them to make sure that everything is aligned, and if not, we follow up with questions. Most importantly, we look to financial documents to corroborate the dollar amounts associated with the request. Often agencies provide spending plans to their OPM analyst, and those are key documents that we would look to and compare amounts from prior years or current year budgeting to the amounts requested in the requisition. We would also look to broader financial documents such as the state budget and federal funding changes. If there are issues, and those issues can be quite minor, involving data entry issues, for example, or they can be rather involved, involving questions of policy or significant dollar changes associated with pre-existing contracts. In those instances, we would follow up with the agency, and that follow-up could be multiple levels. Most often it would be with those staff assigned to the grants and contracts functions or to the fiscal office, but there are times when we may reach out and speak to program leads as well. After a successful review, the analyst will approve the item. It's moved along to the section director, and after a successful review at that secondary level, the requisition will move its way along to the OPM Finance Division. Next slide, please. A quick approval is certainly something that we know the agencies are interested in. And from the OPM budget perspective, there are some factors that make a review process easier and more rapid. First point I would make is that it helps greatly to have a clear introductory sentence that explains why you are asking for the requisition to be approved. Up at the very top of the entry, when the analyst first opens the item. When this is lacking, which is often the case, extra time may have to be taken to review the POS details tab and or conduct other research to clarify the purpose for the requisition. So just to give an example, if the agency is requesting to enter into a new sole source contract with a particular vendor for a given service, it assists greatly to have that stated at the outset to guide our further analysis. The second bullet, this is most helpful within the written comments. Having the dollar amount associated with the requisition arrayed by fiscal year, by fund, by class code. Some agencies enter project codes as well, which is fine. That is extremely useful. Also, if the start and end dates, particularly when a partial state fiscal year contract is being proposed for the initial year, that also helps our review process enormously. And extremely important is that you ensure that your budget analyst on a regular basis receives updated financial documents such as spending plans that drill down to the vendor and service level, or similar documentation for major federal grants, for example. So that the analyst has documents to refer to when reviewing the dollar amount that's been requested. For example, if it is a contract amendment to renew a contract, we will regularly look to the prior year's amount and compare to see if there's any change. And if the change is not explained within the state budget, we would follow up to ask why there is a difference. Also important is for those requests that involve either significant policy changes or significant financial changes that may not have previously been vetted by the OPM analyst, that it's preferable to reach out in advance of submitting a requisition rather than having the first point of contact be the analyst's work list. So for example, if an agency is desiring to terminate a service type and or enter into a brand new contract of a sole source nature that has not been specifically addressed within the state budget, then it's better to reach out in advance to give us a little bit of a heads up and to allow us to enter into advanced discussions about it rather than pursue a requisition first. As Kathleen mentioned, it's extremely helpful for us to have the vendor name included in the requisition name because we very often perform searches to look back at prior requisitions, and having that in the requisition name makes that search process much easier. Next slide, please. The next slide shows an example of a requisition that has two of those items that I just talked about clearly displayed. And this is a shout out to the Department of Children and Families because this is one of their requisitions. First, the reason for the amendment is clearly stated at the very top. In this case, the department was updating information in their contracts after a review process. And so I understand exactly what they're asking me to review and approve. The box at the bottom shows the financial information arrayed by fiscal year. In this particular case, it was a no-cost amendment, so the dollar amounts are zero. When there are non-zero amounts, the dollars would be arrayed across the rows to not only show the amounts by class code, but also by service type. This particular vendor has a scope of service which covers more than one type. So that is enormously helpful because that provides information that facilitates the review of the financial information to corroborate that funds are available, and also allows us to key in on significant changes from prior years should we want to have additional questions put to the agency. Next slide, please. I will now turn it over to Julia for an explanation of her office's role in the process.
Thanks, Joan, and thank you, Kathleen, for those great overviews. Next slide, please. So here I will start by going over the OPM finance review process. So I'll talk sort of generally about these points, and then I will actually go ahead and share my screen in a little bit to show you how I actually go through and review an actual requisition. So the first part of the process is we look at similar to Joan, the requisition type and justification. So we're looking to see, is this an amendment? Is this a new contract? Is it an RFP? And what exactly is being requested? From there, we open the POS or PSA details section to get some background and to look for information on previous contracts for the same service, any amendments that have already been made to this contract. We also open the line details and comment sections to see and learn more about any supporting information and documentation. Then we look at your agency's procurement plan to see whether the requisition in question aligns with your procurement plan. There is a place to indicate in the POS or PSA details whether the request is in line with your procurement plan. We'll go ahead and confirm that. But if it's a significant deviation from your procurement plan and you haven't addressed that in the requisition, we'll probably want to follow up and learn more about that. Next, we'll take a look at the amount of the request, and we'll actually go ahead and compare that to the amount that was spent on this service in previous years. If this is a continuation of an existing service, we look at previous years' annual reports, and we kind of do a quick comparison. Is this a pretty similar amount being spent? And if it's a significant deviation from previous expenditure, that's not addressed somewhere in the explanation of the requisition, we'll have to reach out to get more information. Next, we take a look at the approvals, and we're looking to see who has approved the requisition before it came to OPM. And specifically, we're looking really closely at the agency approval section. The person who enters the requisition should not be the same as the person approving it. And you can think about that approval process as sort of our way to see that your agency has gone through the approval steps and the hierarchy so that we understand that everyone in the agency is on board with the request. And this sort of mirrors the way signatory authorities typically work in written processes. So this is really important, and it signals to myself and Kimberly when we're approving that that the proper approvals have been kind of secured before it comes to us. And like I said, the person submitting the request should not be the same as the person approving the request. From there, once we take a look at the contract approval process, we will then, if it's ready for approval, we'll go ahead and approve. One important thing to note is that if the request has a value of up to $1 million, I will go ahead and approve that on my own. If it's over $1 million, it will go through a second set of eyes and Kim Kennison, the executive financial officer, will do a level of approval and then she'll go ahead and approve it once it looks good to her. So this is sort of the overview. And now, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through an actual approval process or an actual review of an actual requisition. So let me just pull up my screen. So here you should be looking at a requisition, a sample requisition. This is a requisition that I've already approved that was submitted by DOC. So shout out to the Department of Corrections for always doing a really great job with their requisitions. So I'll just walk you through exactly what I described in the previous slide. The first thing I do is I see it's DOC. I see that Christine is the person who submitted it. And I see that it's medium priority, and I see that it's a purchase of service request. As Kathleen mentioned, I do take a close look at the priority line. The fact that it's medium priority tells me if I have questions or if I want to, double check something, if I want to get back to you, or if something comes up and I can't get to this right away, that's okay. I still have a couple days. So if it were high priority, I would treat it as such. So like I said, I see that it's a POS. and they've used this requester's justification section really well. This is what Joan was talking about as well. This is a really great opportunity for you to explain to us as clearly as possible what exactly it is you're requesting. So I know now that it's a POS request, but that's all I know. I just know that it's associated with a POS contract. Here, DOC has taken the time to explain a bunch of more information to me. The current contract is expiring at the end of this month, and they need an amendment to the contract to continue these services. There are federal funds being used that have a limited time frame on them, so they don't have time to go through the competitive process. And they also go ahead and explain that the reason they've chosen this vendor without doing a reprocurement is because they're providing a similar service nearby. So it makes sense for them to continue providing them. So really helpful, really concise, clear information and easy to understand language. So now I understand what's being asked. Then from here, I'll open the POS details. That's this link right here. And this is also really helpful and well filled out. As you can see, I'm going to look, why are they not issuing a new request for proposals? Well, they explain that here. Again, they're using federal funds that have a certain time limit on them, so they need to go ahead and amend this contract, and they don't have time to do a full-blown competitive process. They've also done a really great job of completing all the information from the original contract. They've given me the contract ID. I know when it begins and ends, and I know the maximum amount, and they've even included the description of services here. And I know that they have a previous OPM approval number. That's all really great. They've given me a general overview of the type of service that this contract covers, which is super helpful. So I know what services it is that are needing to be continued. And they also even fill out this section here with the prior amendments, which is super helpful because I can see here that they have previously requested a year-long amendment, and that costed about $163,000. And I can see here that they're requesting another year, and it's $170,000, which is comparable. So I already am brought up to speed. This is about how much this service costs for about a year. So all of that information, I really understand what's going on, what's being requested. From here, I'll go ahead and open the line details, which I'm hoping you folks will be able to see once this cooperates. And so this is what that looks like to me, and it's pretty much the same information, but frequently this is where I can see what time frame is being requested. So sure enough, they've written here it's for a year, like I mentioned, and so we know that this amount, this $170,000, is reasonable compared to what they've spent on it in the past. So really good understanding. I will sometimes look at this requester's comments. In this case, there's not a whole lot of interest here, but I know that sometimes folks include attachments there, and those can be really helpful, and I will take a look at them. Then from here, the next thing I do is I review and take a look at the approvers. And as I mentioned, Christine is the person who submitted this, and it was approved by Michael Letary, who I know is a fiscal manager over at DOC, so it makes sense. Christine submitted it, and then someone in a sort of more administrative managerial capacity hasn't approved it. This looks good to me. I understand why they're doing an amendment. I understand the cost. Even if it wasn't in line with their procurement plan, they provided an explanation for why they can't go out to bid competitively. So from here, I would go ahead and approve this. And just another shout out to DOC, because if all the requisitions I received look like this, things will get approved really quickly. So you can definitely take a page out of their book to make sure that your requisitions are getting approved more quickly. So I'm going to close out of that and ask Lars to put the slideshow back up. Just give us a second, flipping back and forth on screens here. So similar to Joan, thank you, Lars, I'm going to share a little bit about, from my perspective, how you can ensure a quick approval, what I'm looking for, and what might guarantee that we get this through a little bit more quickly and without delay. I talked a little bit about some of these as I walked through the requisition live, but nonetheless, so some of this will be a little bit repetitive. But the first thing is I talked, and Joan also talked about the importance of that requester's justification section. that is a really important section to help orient me or Kimberly in what exactly is being requested. And I would just ask that you try to avoid acronyms and try to avoid using department-specific language in this section. Keep in mind that myself and Kim are reviewing, on average, maybe 5 of these a day when we take a look. We work with agencies all across the state, and all the work that you all do is incredible and it's important. But unfortunately, we can't be intimately familiar with all of it. And so it's really hard for us to understand and make logical sense of a request if we don't understand anything about the program or the issue at hand. So, using references to federal grants and acronyms or some of your programs using acronyms, that's really hard for us to make sense of. I'd also ask that you avoid just copying and pasting things from your contract here. Really try to take the time to write us 2 or 3 sentences in clear English. This is a request for a contract amendment to continue this program. This is a request for an RFP for a new program funded by, and spell out what the funding is. It's really, really hard for me to give an approval if I just don't understand what's going on, and it takes more of my time and causes delays if I have to Google acronyms, and trust me, I do. So a great tip from my perspective would be to just spend a little bit of time coming up with clear and concise language here so that I can really understand what's being asked. The second thing Kathleen mentioned, and I also mentioned, is go ahead and use the priority line to indicate urgency. So if something is really urgent, go ahead and mark it as high priority, and I will respond to that accordingly. That will be the first thing that I review in my work list, and I will understand, hey, this is hot. So don't be shy about using that and using that as a way to communicate urgency to me. The next one is sort of a little tip of something that I've seen recently, but that does cause a little bit of back and forth. We can approve amendments to contracts that have already expired. So if you are sending a requisition today to amend a contract that ended on July 30th, 2021, I will not approve it. That is a sort of a standard contracting tip, but I do see it come up a lot, so I wanted to draw it out. The next tip specifically covers sole source waiver requests. So a lot of times folks are requesting a waiver from the competitive process. And as many of you know, we ask that you both select at least one waiver code and, also provide a little written explanation in the box above that waiver code to justify it. And the reason we ask for the justification in addition to the selection of the waiver code is that the waiver codes are meant to be rather general. They're meant to cover many different types of circumstances, from the type of work that the Department of Environmental Protection does to the type of work that the Department of Children and Families does. These are capturing widely diverse circumstances. So the explanation box is really a chance for you to help me understand how that code specifically applies to your situation. So if it's, emergency services and it's because it's COVID related, spell that out. If it's, the supplier is mandated by federal law, which law? Those types of things help bridge the gap between that really, really vague waiver code that is necessarily vague and the actual reasoning and how it applies to your specific program. The next tip is if you have information that is sort of supported information that might provide and help me understand a little bit more about the request, feel free to attach it. That could include your agency's pre-authorization process. If you're asking a request for an RFP, go ahead and attach the RFP that you've drafted. If you're saying that you can't go through a competitive process because the supplier was listed in the federal award, go ahead and attach the federal award. Those types of things just help answer any questions and preempt any confusion that we might have. And the more information, the better in this case. So don't be shy with attaching things. And then, as I mentioned, we will flag requisitions when we notice a really big change in the amount of funding being requested for a similar service. So use the requisition as an opportunity to help us understand why a service might have increased and why funding might have increased. Maybe in the case of some of the health and human services, you're adding more beds. Maybe in the case of a PSA with a trainer, you're adding more training sessions. All of that is really helpful for us to understand any significant deviation from last year's spending to the new request spending. So those are just a couple of tips and tricks. We'll go to the next slide, please. So for these next 2 slides, I just wanted to share some additional examples of things that I've found really helpful in requisitions in the past. This is a requester justification section from a request from the Department of Children and Families. So another shout out to DCF for doing a great job. And here you can see that there are acronyms in the requester justification, but they spell them out. So I now know all what these acronyms mean and what programs are in question. There's also clearly an explanation that there's a critical need. And in the second paragraph, I'm given a really clear understanding of how the funding will be used. They're hiring another position. That's why they need this amendment. And they explain to me what that position is going to be used for. So now I'm thinking, okay, this amount of money seems reasonable to add one more person who's going to have these responsibilities. So this is really concise. It's really clear. This is a great example of what you can do to help me help you and approve a requisition quickly. Next slide, please. And this is another really good example. This is also from the Department of Corrections. This is what I'm talking about when I'm saying to please provide more information than just the waiver codes when you're asking for a sole source waiver. And as you can see here in the background, DOC has selected 3 waiver codes. So they've followed that. They've provided us with that data. Then they've gone ahead and provided a really robust explanation for why they can't go through a competitive process. And they talk about their procurement plan and how this is actually in line with their procurement plan, that they weren't intending to rebid this until 2024. That's really helpful. And I understand why specifically this vendor makes sense to use for this service because of their location and their previous experience. So this is really helpful and I think very justifiable in terms of granting a waiver from competition. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the outset in the agenda, Joan and I are going to go over a couple of, we talked a little bit about really good examples of requisitions, and now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about why we might hold a requisition. So Joan, do you want to talk a little bit about instances that might cause the budget analyst to hold a requisition?
Certainly, thank you. First, if there are follow-up questions about a particular requisition, some analysts prefer to place a hold immediately and transmit their questions through the comments box that's associated with the hold process. Other analysts, particularly for less involved or minor issues, would not place a hold, but would prefer to contact the agency directly via phone or email, for example, and resolve any minor issues more rapidly without having to go the hold route. If an issue cannot be resolved quickly, or whether the question is one which will likely take a sufficient amount of time to get a response, then a hold may be placed. Also, if the funding source that's identified for a requisition is not definite, if, for example, it is contingent upon the enactment of the state budget and we are not completely through that process, not finalized, that would clearly be a reason for a hold. So if the funding source is not solid, a hold will likely be placed and questions would probably be put to the agency. And lastly, if the policy implications of a particular requisition necessitate further review, either more broadly within OPM or perhaps within the state government at large through contact with sister state agencies, that could be a reason for a hold to be placed. Over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Joan. So yeah, so in terms of the OPM Finance Office, I think I kind of touched on some of these a little bit in my previous slides, but one thing that would cause us to hold a requisition is if we have questions about the funding or the program. And I know that's really broad, but that sort of says, you know, if I don't understand why a change is being requested to a contract, or why a new contract is needed, or why, you know, the funding amount requested has increased so much, these are the types of questions that you can try to preempt by writing a really clear requester's justification. And if you don't, that might cause me to place a hold and either follow up via email or ask a question through the comments. The next bullet is if I have concerns about a non-competitive procurement. So as I mentioned, there are many, many times when requesting a waiver from competition is completely reasonable and can be explained very well. But there are other times when I feel like the explanation is lacking, or you've just chosen a waiver code and not really given me a further explanation. And if it's a contract that's been going on for a really long time with the same vendor, or it's a program that hasn't been rebid in a decade, those are going to be times where I'm going to go ahead and put a hold and say, when is your plan to rebid this? If it's also different from your procurement plan, as I mentioned, and you don't provide an explanation for why that has changed, that's another place where I will go ahead and put a hold and ask, for more information. So a lot of these holds can really be avoided by just trying to put yourself in my shoes, understand that I have such a limited understanding of each of the incredibly important programs that you all are doing, and taking the time to walk me through how we got to this request, why things are different than they have been in the past. That can really eliminate the need for, I would say, 3/4 of the holds that I issue. The last category is also a really significant and common cause for a hold on a requisition, and that is if there's an error in the requisition. If you haven't selected a waiver code on a sole source request, if the dollar amount doesn't match a dollar amount that you put in the comments, if the dates are wrong, if things are blank, those are times where I'm just going to hold it and write in the comments, please fix this, or please clarify this. One thing that I find really confusing is sometimes in the sole source justification for the waiver, people will say, oh, this was bid competitively through an RFP in 2017. That's really confusing. References to previous RFPs are confusing. Anything that I'm confused about that seems like it could be, quickly fixed and it seems like sort of just an error in the completion of the requisition, those are things that I will automatically put a hold on. So submitters and approvers, go ahead and take a scan through the requisition and make sure that things are filled out in a complete and correct manner before you're hitting approve, so that when it comes to me, I have sort of the complete set of information. So that sort of, I think, covers most of the circumstances where we might have a hold. Next slide, please. So before we get to questions and answers, I just wanted to share a couple of additional resources that are available to you. If you need more information, have a question about how to do a requisition. The first is from the core CT side. As Kathleen mentioned, there are a number of job aids that the core team has put together that are sort of basically slideshows, little trainings that help you understand how to do things on the technical side of core. And there is also a link here to the core help page. So if you need to request a training or submit a footprints ticket, you can do that there. On the OPM budget side, I'm publishing a list that the budget office publishes of all the budget analysts and which agencies they work with. So if you're not sure and you have a budget related question, definitely those are the folks you want to reach out to. And then finally, from my side on OPM Finance, my team and I have produced a lot of training materials already this year that are available for you on our website. So that's a link here. And I'm really your main point of contact. So any questions you have, any confusion I have will probably be coming from me. So you can definitely bring yourself up to date on the existing training materials, because I think there's a lot of good stuff in there about how to do an RFP, how to do a sole source request, and just some general information about why the procurement process is so important. So that really concludes the slides that we have for you today. And now we can move on to Q&A. I know I haven't seen too many questions pop up, so really don't be shy. Take this as an opportunity to let us help you make sure that we're getting everything approved in a timely manner.
Great. Well, as folks start putting their questions into the Q&A, I do think we have a couple that we can cover. So this first question actually may be for all presenters, Julia, Joan, and Kathleen. but I think some folks found the presentation really helpful in terms of for their own agency level review, what they should be looking at and kind of taking some of the tips and tricks from how OPM is looking at it. But are there other steps that you're expecting folks internally to be looking for as they review requisitions? And is that something that maybe there's a separate job aid to provide additional detail?
I can try to answer that. So I think if I understand correctly, it's sort of a question about whether there are like specific steps that the agency approver needs to take. And I would just say, you know, you could use this slideshow as sort of a guideline for that, to what to look for before you hit approve. We don't necessarily, from my perspective in OPM finance, and I don't know if this is different for budget, but we don't necessarily dictate your internal approval process. But ideally, yeah, just having another set of eyes, you know, on the text that's being placed in and checking if there are any empty fields, making sure, you know, taking a look back at your own previous expenditures on a similar program or similar contract and making sure that you're addressing any huge deviations. All of that can certainly happen at the agency level before it comes to OPM. So definitely, I would definitely suggest that, but there's nothing super specific beyond that. I don't know, Joan, if there's any materials that OPM budget has that specifically sort of help agency approvers.
No, nothing specific. We do trust and rely upon the fiscal offices to vet the requisition requests before they come to us for consistency with their available funds. And by and large, that is a very successful process. So we thank the agencies for that.
Great. Well, I think the next question that we can talk through is some curiosity around both OPM budget and OPM finances review timelines. Is there a sort of a standard timeline for how quickly you both are committing to sort of looking at requisitions and getting them approved?
Well, I can start. It is almost a continuous process. We monitor our work lists on a daily basis. The review process does involve multiple staff within the office. So depending upon the time of the year and our other obligations, and sometimes a little bit of time elapses before the analyst and the section director can both get to an item. If there are requisitions that are urgent, we do suggest that the agency give us a phone call to let us know that they're coming our way. But generally that's few and far between. And again, those that are more time consuming generally are so for valid reasons involving our review process.
And I can just add from the finance side, I look at my work list at least once a day, and I do my best to address everything, you know, on a daily basis. Obviously, there are times, you know, as Joan sort of mentioned, when there are competing priorities, and if it is a requisition that has a lot of mistakes or leaves me with a lot of questions, and it feels like it's going to take a lot of time to address. Sometimes I, you know, save that for the next day, as long as it's not high priority, when I have a little bit of more time to look at it. As I mentioned, requisitions that are over $1 million in value will have to be approved by Kimberly Kennison, and I will push those requisitions that need her approval and review to her a couple times a week. Again, if it is urgent and needs to be addressed that day, both Kimberly and I are really respectful of that. And so if you communicate that to us, we really do our utmost to address and, you know, get something through as soon as we can. But on a typical week for a typical requisition, I'll take a look every day, do my best to sort of go through the straightforward ones as soon as possible, do any follow-up. That might take a couple days, and then at least a couple times a week, I'll put make sure that Kim Kennison is reviewing those additional, those over $1 million requests at least a couple times a week.
Great. Well, I think shifting gears, there's one specific question around how to handle what to put for the dollar value of the requisition, especially for a competitive solicitation or RFP when there may not be a specified budget at that point. Do you have any recommendations from either OPM Finance or OPM Budget on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Colin. I can start, and definitely would be curious to hear if Joan has other thoughts on it. From our perspective, we know that an RFP is really the initial planning stages. A ballpark is really great and really helpful, and we know that it's subject to change. And so just picking a number that you think is in the ballpark of what it might end up being would be great. And you can certainly indicate in the request or justification or elsewhere in the requisition that it's just an estimate and then it might change, or that you're really just estimating at this stage. But we understand there's some uncertainty, but it's really helpful just to have a general idea. And we're not, scrutinizing that as closely at the RFP stage, but we do want there to be a dollar value associated with it. Joan, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I would say there should be some sort of a general sense of the funding that will be available to support an RFP. If one would think that there would either be an indication in a proposed state budget or perhaps proposed federal funding of certain amounts, or if an agency is looking to its pre-existing resources, that there would be some sort of an upper bound on what that dollar amount might be, so that should inform the process. But those are my thoughts at the moment.
Great. I think to bring in a more technical question that may be for Kathleen, there's a question around, can you edit a requisition after it has started to go through the approval workflow?
What was the question?
There's a question around, can you edit a requisition that's already started to be approved through the workflow? Absolutely.
You can go through Manage Rec and then search for your requisition. On the right of that requisition that you bring up will be a drop down, and you can choose Edit. And depending upon where it is in workflow and depending upon what you edit, it could reinitiate workflow. So if you change the quantity or if you change the dollar value, it will definitely reinitiate workflow. But unless the requisition is converted into a contract, you can always edit the requisition.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. You actually helped to answer another one of the questions. So there's a new question that just came in around, first off, thanking the group for some good examples about best practice requisitions. Are there any examples that you may be able to share that were put on hold or that had some problems that you could point out as sort of a learning experience?
I can jump in on this one to start, certainly give Joan an opportunity as well. I think we definitely don't want to embarrass anyone, and we know that everyone is super busy and doing their best, and that a lot of the issues that we face are, due to time constraints, just trying to get things done. And so we didn't want to, put anyone on blast, as it were, and share any real life examples that we were disappointed with. But I can sort of try to bring in a couple of things that have happened of late that have resulted in a hold without being too specific, because as I said, I think everyone's really doing their best, and I totally understand that. For me, as I mentioned, if I'm seeing in a request or justification section, I recently got a requisition that continuously referred to a program by its acronym, and I had no idea what that acronym was. And for me, it's really hard for me as a person. I'm trying to make a logical determination about whether a request makes sense. And if I don't understand what the request is for, it's really, really hard for me to move past that and judge whether it's sensible or not. So this one had a reference to a specific program that used an acronym that I was just totally unfamiliar with. And that really threw me off. And the request or justification also had a couple of grammatical errors. So it was just really confusing and I did not understand what was being requested. Another example of a request or justification that doesn't really help me is sometimes I have one agency in mind in particular that will often, they do really important work, as all of you do. And so their contracts are to address really prevalent problems happening in the state of Connecticut. And what they'll do in the request or justification is they'll define the problem. So they'll say XYZ is a really big issue in the state of Connecticut. 30% of people of this race in the state of Connecticut face this problem. Super interesting, but it doesn't tell me anything about the contract. It tells me a lot about, and it educates me in a way, and I like learning about that. But in terms of helping to determine whether a request is reasonable, it doesn't say, oh, this contract is for 4 staff members to work in this community where this issue is really prevalent. It just tells me that there's a prevalent issue. So that's one example of something that is really tricky. More recently, I currently have a contract on hold. This one might be good as something that's a little bit more complex. Again, without getting into too many specifics, an agency is requesting a new contract for a service that is currently under contract that's set to expire at the end of this month. And they need more time to complete the contract, which is totally fine. Typically, I would expect to see an amendment for that. But in this case, the agency was requesting a new contract. And in their justification for why they were doing a new contract rather than an amendment, they were using a lot of technical terms and acronyms that I didn't understand to justify that. And to me, it's not a best practice to do a brand new contract when it's the exact same scope of work with the exact same supplier. So we've had some back and forth to sort of understand why they're doing it this way. They have provided some information that has helped justify that, but that is something that I've had to go back and forth on, and it's a large dollar amount, so that also requires the approval of Kimberly Kennison, and she often, especially when there's such a big dollar amount involved, a lot of questions will come up that will sort of, we want as much information as possible. So that's a great example of sort of an unusual circumstance that wasn't necessarily sufficiently explained in the initial requisition that's caused a delay. So there's just a couple of examples. Again, I didn't want to put up any on the screen because I didn't want to embarrass anyone. And I know everyone's really doing their best, but for me, it's really a clear request or justification. Anywhere where you're putting in text, remember that I can't be intimately familiar with everything that you do, so walk me through it. And anything unusual, help me understand why that might be happening. I don't know if Joan has any specific thoughts on maybe something in her work list that's on hold that is a good example of, you can speak generally about that maybe is a good example of something that could be improved.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the problems generally you can categorize in 3 areas. First, there are, not often, but it happens, there are data entry errors that I pick up on fairly quickly. For example, a requisition being put in to renew a contract, and I know that contract has been historically funded through a particular SID or class code, as the case may be, and I see a different one on the requisition that represents nothing more than an inadvertent mistake at the agency level, but it requires me to have to follow up to have a correction made before I can pin off. So that's sort of minor but time-consuming things that have to be addressed. I'd say more importantly and more majorly, those agencies that don't routinely share detailed spending plans with their budget analyst, those documents are invaluable to the requisition review process, particularly from the state appropriated funds side of things. So having those documents available to us facilitates the process. When we don't, it will lead to more questions and possible holds. And lastly, and I don't know whether I would categorize this as a problem per se, but for contracts that are funded through federal grants, when I encounter a requisition that has a very large dollar amount on it, multi-millions, for example, I'm not comfortable pinning off on that without speaking to the agency's chief financial officer to confirm that the amount has been fully vetted and that he or she is comfortable with that requisition. I do trust that that review has happened before it comes to me, but just the sheer size of some of these that crosses my desk makes me pause, and for my own comfort level, I have to pursue that extra level of contact with the agency. So those are my thoughts on that question.
Great. Thank you, Joan and Julia. So the next question, which we can go to, is a specific question around a piece of the requisition to populate. So for amendments, when you're amending a contract, should folks be putting the additional amount as the requisition total or the new total contract amount with the amendment included?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. From our vantage point, it needs to be, so if you're amending a contract and the requisition is for the amendment, the requisition value should be for the amount being added to the contract, not the resulting total contract amount. So for example, if you have a contract that's $1 million and you're requesting an amendment for $500,000, the amendment requisition value should be $500,000, not $1.5 million. The reason for that from our end is that when we approve a requisition, we've sort of approved that funding. So when we approve your existing requisition for your existing $1 million contract for $1 million, we signed off on that $1 million. If you then request a requisition for 1.5 million, it looks like we've now requested a total of 2.5 million. So we've already approved 1 million and now we're approving 1.5 million. And also that is how CORE collects the data. They will add the 500,000 of the amendment so that in the CORE record for that contract, it shows the total amount. So CORE automatically does the totaling for you. So to make that very clear, if you're requesting an amendment, the amendment amount, the requisition amount for that amendment should be just the amount being added or in some cases subtracted, not the new total.
Great. So a couple of new questions just came in. I think one individual who's likely reviewing requisitions asked, is there a way to get metrics for a department or division which can give managers an idea of how many requests from their staff are getting put on hold, or if there's problems that they can try to work with their team to improve future requisitions?
I am not aware of any reporting functionality that we have formally. I would say that for the OPM finance review, I am looking at every single requisition that comes through. And if you're concerned about your agency or looking to learn a little bit more information about your agency's performance, quote unquote, definitely feel free to reach out. If you're in sort of an approval capacity and you're wondering, hey, what's going on here? I can sort of share that with you, not anecdotally, it will definitely be from the experience I've had with your agency, and I can take a look back at my email correspondence and I can actually access the comments that have been left on the requisition. So that might be a way for me to kind of informally report to you on your agency's performance. And then I know, like I mentioned earlier, each agency has their own budget analyst that is assigned to that agency. And so that person might be able to share sort of from the budget perspective, anything that could be improved, but I'll let Joan chime in if there's anything to add on that.
We don't maintain any sort of metrics of the sort described. It's not my personal experience to place holds frequently. I'd say in the course of a year, I don't believe I do it more than 10 times. And in those instances, it's not generally for a lengthy period of time. It's usually resolved within a matter of days. The other again, more frequent issues are just minor technical entry issues that need to be addressed, but we don't maintain any sort of a count of how often that occurs.
I would just add really quickly on that, like from my perspective, and I don't want to speak for the budget analysts, but I am more than happy to have that conversation with anyone who's interested. Again, no formal reporting, but if this is something that you're concerned about or want to learn more about, definitely feel free to email me and I will do my best to sort of talk through with you and find, and we can discuss if there are areas for improvement. So thanks for that question.
One of the things that you could do in Core CT though is go to Manage Rec, select the rec type, and then select the status of the rec. Also put in the business unit, and you can bring up any recs that are on hold within your agency. So at any given time, anyone that has access to Manage Rec, an approver, a requester, you can go in and you can see what is put on hold.
Thanks, Kathleen. So there is a specific policy related question around, can a time period be edited after OPM approval prior to going to the Attorney General's office if it's within 1 year? So for example, the requisition was approved for a 6-month contract, but you're changing it to be a 1-year contract.
That is a good question. And I just speaking very frankly, I feel like I kind of need to think about that one. So I might punt that and get back to you all, but thank you. I just want to be honest and not give you the wrong information. So let me think about that and discuss with Kim Kennison, and we'll get back to you on that one. Thank you for that question, and sorry to not be able to provide an answer right away.
Great. So I know, Julia, we have about 15 minutes left. There's a couple more questions we can go through, but I just wanted to check in on time. Should we keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going. I mean, we have everyone till 2:30, hopefully. So definitely, if we can get to these questions, would love to do that live.
Okay, there is a question, and I'm interpreting this, so definitely whoever asked this, feel free to clarify if I'm getting this wrong, but they asked about the PSA waiver forms, the standard forms that each agency uses, like the request for PSA, request for competitive solicitation, request for amendment, and request for non-competitive PSA. Are these updated? So I'm wondering, this is either in my mind asking about the job aids or about standard forms for agencies to pre-populate before going in core on this. I don't know, Julie or Kathleen, if you have a better, or Joan, if you have a better sense for this question.
I think my assumption here is that this is in regards to some forms that are used internally on the agency side. And I have actually gotten questions about this, so that's what I'm going to answer. But feel free to shoot us another question if this is not the right thing. But so the agency specific process is not mandated by OPM. There are certain things that OPM requires happens and suggests that should happen in the agency specific process, but you know, the Department of Agriculture can sort of feel free to set its own process, and that might include these additional waiver forms. But to us, what we're looking at are the documentation that we get to review that shows that all of the steps have been followed is the actual requisition. That's why it's important to us that the approver, the agency level approver is completed correctly, because to me that says that the person filling it out has correctly provided all the information into the financial system of record, and that their supervisor or someone else in sort of some management capacity is signaling, yes, this is approved. So my suggestion, we would not mandate, we don't update your agency specific forms. Those are kept by your agency procurement or contracts office or business office. And my request vis-a-vis those forms is just that you do your best to make sure that the people approving the sort of approval process that I see in the core rec mirrors the actual approval process that's happening on your agency's end. But for me, those forms are internal. They aren't used to communicate with OPM really. What you use to communicate with OPM is the actual requisition. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. Well, we will keep an eye out to see if there's any further clarification. There is another question that came in about no cost amendments and how OPM budget and OPM finance want to see those submitted.
I can start, and then if Joan has anything to add. No cost amendments, you can put the value as $0 and then use the requester justification section to explain what you are actually requesting a change to. And that kind of helps us see, okay, this is what the change is. Maybe it's an extension in the term of the contract, or maybe there's a slight change to the scope of work. I know some of you folks are really good about saying, oh, we actually, the contractor changed its address and we're updating that in the contract. So, here's an amendment request for that. So that's sort of what I would be looking for.
And the same for me, just a very brief summary up at the very top indicating what the change is and that it results in no dollar change to the contract value. And that would move through us quite quickly.
Great. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come in. I don't know, Julie or Joan, if there's anything else that you're seeing that you wanted to highlight, or Kathleen.
No, I think all these questions were great. We are happy to sort of wrap up 10 minutes early, give everyone time before their next meeting. And I just want to thank everyone so much for taking the time to join a training today. As usual, as I usually do with my trainings, I will be publishing a recording of this as well as the slides in the coming days, and I will send out an email once that is available. So just keep your eye out for that. If you are on the training distribution list, we can get that to you that way. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. And if you attended this training and are not on my email distribution list, definitely ping me to let me know, and I can add you super easily. The next slide is our little thank you slide. So thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to Kathleen and Joan for participating and helping us sort of put all the puzzle pieces together of how to do a requisition. Thanks to Lars and Colin for helping out behind the scenes and with the Q&A. And we appreciate you all being here. Happy to give you 10 minutes back and look forward to seeing you all at our next training. So thanks, everyone. We're going to end the training now. Take care, everyone.